About time for us to get started this evening. It's nice to see everyone. We've been having a good week and a good day so far. I just want to say I enjoy this class. As I've been putting together this material, I've learned some stuff. Now, I don't know if you could say the same, that you've enjoyed it or learned anything, but I certainly have, and I'm grateful for that. We are about in the middle of our quarter here. And we'll have a class next week. The week after that will be our gospel meeting. And then I think we'll have just the month of May, 4 Wednesdays in May. And that'll be it for James, at least for now. We are right about the beginning of chapter 2. So we probably will not finish in those 5-6 classes, which is completely fine. I didn't really expect to finish. And like I said before, I really don't want to feel like we've got to rush through just for the sake of finishing. We could finish in 5 weeks, but would it do us any good? Probably not. So just say all that to say that I appreciate you guys, appreciate this class, and I enjoyed it. We're in James chapter 2, like I said, James chapter 2. We're looking at verses 1 through 4, where James introduces the problem of partiality that was apparently pretty widespread among the church in the first century, so much so that James included it in this letter. And we've pretty much wrapped up this section, but there's just a few more comments that I would like to make, and of course, if you've got anything you'd like to share, I more than welcome that. But let's get a refresher of the text. Let's go back and read verses 1 through 4 of James chapter 2. James says, "My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality." And then he gives that example that we spent most of last week looking at. "For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and say to him, 'You sit here in a good place,' and say to the poor man, 'You stand there, or sit here at my footstool,' have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" So just as a refresher, last week we spent some time looking at the difference between the rich and the poor. This is a theme that we looked at in chapter 1. It's a theme we see here, and it'll continue up until verse 14 of chapter 2. So we'll continue to explore this idea because James continues to try to teach us about this dynamic. But we looked at, what is said about the rich. He comes in with these fine clothes, these expensive clothes available only to the wealthy. And then in verse 3, we looked at the poor man who comes in, in what we've called kind of peasant clothes, workers' clothes. He doesn't have an extra church outfit, if you will. He's just got the one outfit. And we looked at how they're treated. Obviously, the rich is shown partiality. He's given the best seat, while the poor is told, stand in the back. No one really wants to look at you. If you have to sit down, I guess you can sit at my footstool. Just kind of stay out of sight, right? And James, of course, says that's a problem. That's not how we ought to treat people as Christians. We've got to reject that temptation. That, I don't know if I'll call it a natural temptation, because I think prejudices and partiality is a learned behavior for the most part. But we've got to reject that maybe common behavior. I'll call it a common behavior that maybe we're all prone to from time to time. And then we kind of finished up the class looking at the temptation to be partial. Why is it that people in James' time were prone to partiality, and why is it that it persists even today? Why is it that as human beings, we insist almost on making these judgments between individuals? And we ended class with what I thought was a really good discussion of this topic. Because I think pretty much all the bases have been covered, we won't really rehash that discussion. But what I've got in my notes here before we move on to this next section is kind of in line with what I think Matt shared at the end of class. I don't know if you remember exactly what he said, but basically, why is it that we have the temptation to be partial, specifically in this case to the rich? Probably because we think they can do something for us. The poor man walks in, and what do you think? I mean, if you put yourself in this kind of context that James is writing in, right? You're probably an oppressed, poor worker Christian who has lost everything for your faith, right? If you were a Jewish person and you converted to Christianity, if you had a business, you probably lost all your customers because you defected from Judaism. If you were in a very tight-knit family, you were probably pushed out of your family because you reject Judaism now and follow Christ. You probably don't have many friends. You probably don't have many family members. And you're probably just kind of scraping by, right? That's probably the typical situation for a Christian in this situation. So if another worker class person, another poorer person comes in, and worker class obviously is not the right word there, but someone who is of the lower class in this society comes in, what are they going to do for me? They're just as bad off as I am. Right? That would probably be the thought, right? But a rich individual comes in wearing expensive clothes, and remember we talked about he's literally gold-fingered. He's got so many gold rings on his hands that his whole fingers look like they're made of gold. Well, this guy, he can help me out, right? I want to be friends with that guy because maybe he'll share some wealth with me. That's probably at least one of the reasons, I think probably the main reason why these Christians were so tempted to show partiality to begin with. And then there's also the idea of, this common sharing that went on among the Christians in that time, and hopefully goes on still today. In Acts chapter 2, probably a familiar example, that on the day of Pentecost, after those 3,000 souls are added to the church, we read about an interesting thing happening in verses 44 and 45. I'll read that real quick. You're more than welcome to follow along, but real quickly, Acts chapter 2, 44 and 45. It says, "Now all who believed were together and had all things in common." And that doesn't mean that they liked the same music and they watched the same TV shows. That means that they were, in one sense, a community, a very close community. They had all things in common. They shared with one another. Verse 5 elaborates, "These Christians sold their possessions and good and divided them among all, as anyone had need." So that was a common practice, right? The church was heavily persecuted. Most of its members didn't have much, so if you did have something, you weren't necessarily obligated, but there was certainly a precedent for selling whatever you may have had. Usually the example given is land, and sharing the profits among the brethren. So again, this rich man comes into your assembly. He's got some things that he can share, right? He's got some possessions he could sell to help take care of our needs. And, you've got to, on one hand, sympathize with these brethren. it's hard to imagine being in the situation that surely a lot of them were in, having no family, no friends, provide for yourself. It's not hard to imagine this desire to be partial. But nonetheless, James warns us against it. And the strongest, part of this warning comes in verse 4. Verse 4 again of James chapter 2. James says, "Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" That's the heart of the issue. Right? Partiality makes us an unrighteous judge. Partiality makes us an unrighteous judge. That's really the issue here with partiality, prejudice, and the like. So a question that gets asked a lot, I think, looking around, we probably are familiar with the answer, but is it a sin to judge? Is it a sin to judge? It's almost a trick question. I'll just put that asterisk next to the question. It's almost a trick question.
Yes or no?
Well, it depends, I guess, would be my answer. Daryl?
It depends on the circumstances. If we didn't do the harsh right for judging another that we care about, we'll admonish them, exhort them, especially we don't have others. But, Paul had to deal with that in 1 Corinthians 5. Where, one of the probably allegiance and fornication, having his father's wife, I think it's what it was, been married.
Yeah.
And Paul placed judgment in what you think. He said, just the fact that I've heard of that, y'all have already taken care of it. So there has to be judgment to properly institute scriptural discipline in the church.
Yeah.
But the Bible does teach about hypocritical judgment. Matthew 7 is that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Matthew 7:1, the sinner's favorite verse, "Judge not, lest you be judged," right? That's the verse that everyone can quote. But there's some caveats, right? Some things we need to talk about. First is the text.
Okay, and in John chapter 7, verse 24, it says, "Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment."
Exactly. Yeah. And to kind of put these thoughts together, what Daryl said, and then that scripture, to use Daryl as an example. If Daryl commits murder, would it be me judging him to call him a murderer? Or would that just be a plain assessment of the facts? That would just be an assessment of the facts, right? If I steal something from a store and you call me a thief, are you judging me or are you just assessing the facts? Just assessing the facts, right? I stole something. By definition, I would be a thief, right? So that's the sense in which we must make righteous judgments. When we see a brother or even a non-Christian in sin, we need to assess the facts. We need to see what's going on. And, we don't need to make accusations, just accusations. But if we see something, we know what's going on, their soul is in danger, it's not being judgmental to bring that up. Daryl, I know you murdered someone yesterday, brother. You shouldn't do that. Right? Maybe a call to the police might be necessary there, but that's just the example that we gave, right? That wouldn't be a judgment. But on the other hand, there is unrighteous judgment. If there's righteous judgment, by necessity, there's unrighteous judgment, sinful judgment. And that's the kind of judgment, obviously, that we should avoid, right? That's where we judge someone based on appearance, where we judge someone's maybe worthiness of the gospel. Right? We see someone who maybe doesn't look the way that we think a decent person should look. So we think, well, they're never going to become a Christian. They're not worthy of the gospel. They can never be saved. That's the kind of judgment that we need to avoid. This unrighteous, unfair judgment, either based on appearances, perhaps maybe something that we might call making a final judgment of someone's worthiness, that kind of thing. Right? Where we go beyond the facts, beyond a concern for their soul, but instead judge for whatever other reason. And there are a couple of scriptures that kind of deal with this. We'll look at a couple. In John chapter 8 and verse number 15, John chapter 8 and verse 15, Jesus says, "You judge according to the flesh." Interestingly, Jesus says, "I judge no one." And that's another statement that kind of gets an asterisk, next to it, because obviously Jesus Is God. God is the only one that can judge our soul, our worthiness, that sort of thing. But the reason I include this is because if Jesus says, I judge no one, again, with this unrighteous judgment in mind, then who am I to go around judging people? If Jesus, plainly says, I judge no one, why would I ever think I could take that upon myself? Another one, before we move on, is Acts chapter 10 and verse number 34. Acts 10, verse number 34. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, in truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality. This is, of course, in the context of Cornelius, the first Gentile convert. Right? Peter said, wow, I finally realized God doesn't care if I'm a Jew or a Gentile. It doesn't matter. He's not partial. And, partiality is a judgment based on appearances, an unrighteous judgment. So I won't beat a dead horse here. I think we get the idea. So to answer the question, is it a sin to judge? Depends on the kind of judgment that we're doing. But judging based on appearances, showing partiality based on our perception of another person, certainly is wrong. Any thoughts on this section, verses 1 through 4, before we move on to a very similar section, verses 5 through 7? All right.
I find it interesting where it talks about partiality and also evil. So I guess I've never seen that before, that verse. So that just tells me that if you are partial, which makes a human cause, not godly cause, those are evil cause. So as Christians, we got to be not partial. So we got to stray from that. I know it's kind of hard to do that in a lot of situations. There's partiality in a lot of things, like in sports. If you're in a sport, and if you're a good player, you're only going to hang around people that are good as you. You're not going to hang around people that are not as good. So that's partiality. So that's everywhere. And also, if you're in a job with an employer in an office setting, you're going to hang around people that are higher ups, not lower ups.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere. So that is something we as Christians we got to avoid all kinds of partiality. If you do, and those are all considered evil thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. A really good point. It's just sometimes it's just a subconscious thing. You don't even think about it. You don't mean to slight anybody else, but it just kind of, again, I won't say it naturally happens, but it just kind of happens. So lots of areas, and it's a really good point, where this is applicable. Any other thoughts here? All right, verses 5 through 7 is really just a continuation and an elaboration on verses 1 through 4. But 5 through 7 reads, listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do not they blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? So James here just kind of points out the absurdity of the situation. Obviously, it's a sin. He makes that clear in verse 4. But now he just kind of makes a common sense sort of argument, right? Why would you participate in partiality? It makes no sense. So again, we'll look at these two groups mentioned. A lot has already been said about the rich and the poor. If you've been here, and I believe everybody here has been here for most, if not all, the other studies, this will probably sound familiar. But some things that James says here. First, about the poor. He says that the poor have been chosen. In verse 5, has not God chosen the poor of this world? Now, again and again, we've brought up this idea of Calvinism, just because it's such a prevalent doctrine in today's religious world. Just about half of everybody, maybe more than half of everybody that you talk to that is religiously minded, specifically, biblically minded, they're probably going to be a Calvinist. It's a doctrine that's very widespread. Most of the Protestant world is Calvinist. So if we want to have productive conversations with those people, and I think we all do, we need to at least understand a little bit about what they believe, where they're coming from. And this class is not about Calvinism. I'm certainly not about to turn it into Calvinism. But this is a passage, or specifically verse 5, that a Calvinist may choose to use because of that word choose. That kind of worked out. Choose to choose. Because it talks about God choosing. So they'll turn to this passage and they'll say, look, doesn't it say there that God chose the poor? Well, there you go. God chooses those who will be saved. Right? The Calvinist idea is before God made everything, before he made the world, he sat down with this big list of names, and he went through the list and either gave you a check, you're going to be saved and you're going straight to heaven when you die, or an X. There's no hope for you. It doesn't matter what you do. You're condemned. That's Calvinism in a very simple, maybe unfair to the whole idea, but a very simple understanding of one doctrine of Calvinism. So they'll say here, look, God chose individuals for salvation. Therefore, Calvinism is correct. Just something to mention here. The word chose is always used, or elected, whatever the word may be, is always used to describe a group of people, never individuals, right? It's always a group. In this case, it's the general group of the poor. And as we've seen before, and we continue to see, it's not the poor specifically, but it's the mindset of the poor that God has chosen, right? Again, we've talked about, I've used the word stereotype before. The stereotype of the poor and the stereotype of the rich are what's being described. The poor typically are humble. They rely on God more. They're faithful. And the rich are the opposite. They're haughty. They rely on themselves. They don't need God. That kind of idea. So he's chosen the poor. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we read there about God choosing a group. Ephesians chapter 1, verse number 4. And that one, since it's quick, I'll turn there. Ephesians 1, verse 4 also talks about this idea of election, God choosing. He says, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love. Again, you notice he chose us. Who's us? Christians. He chose the church to be saved. He chose the body of the faithful to be saved. I probably have done more damage than good there, muddied the water more than I've cleared things up there. But any thoughts from you about anything? This idea of being chosen, I think, I was vague because I think we understand it, maybe get the idea. But any thoughts you have on this idea of being chosen, God choosing?
The one thought I have is when it says that God chose us or chose them, or like I said, a group of people, it's really vice versa when we're there, that we chose God. We chose God. He chose us.
Yes, that's exactly it. God has chosen us to save the faithful, and we choose whether or not we're going to be faithful, right? That's just as simple as it needs to be. I think that was perfectly said. We choose whether or not to be faithful. And, this idea of God being merciful, looking upon favorably the poor of this world is certainly something that we see throughout the life of Jesus. A couple scriptures that might be useful here are Matthew chapter 11 and verse number 5. Jesus here says, and I wish we could kind of look at the greater context here, but just because I'm making this point in passing, verse 5, the blind see and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. The downtrodden, the oppressed, people that society has looked over, those are the ones that come to preach the gospel to. Does that exclude the rich? No, right? But the poor, again, represent an idea, a mindset. And there are several passages like this. We won't look at all of them, but if you take notes, maybe Luke 4:18 is another one where the same idea is conveyed. Luke 6, verse 20, we also see this idea as well. Jesus favored the poor. Not at the exclusion of the rich, but favored the poor. So we might say, in summation, the poor have a special place in God's heart. We won't belabor it. We won't say any more than needs to be said. The poor have a special place in God's heart. One commentator said, and I thought this was worth passing on about the poor. They wrote, it isn't their poverty that impresses God, right? Anybody can be poor, theoretically. It's not their poverty that impresses God. It's their indifference to the pursuit of worldly possessions. That's the idea. That's the idea here. Now, this other group, the rich. The rich are not inherently evil. 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19, give instructions to the rich. Behave like this. And, he doesn't condemn them. He doesn't say they're in sin. But you've got to be careful, right? Less.
If you make it find Jesus, bless of the poor, it doesn't not necessarily mean monetary. It means those who are poor in spirit.
Right.
Humility, kindness, those who have a receptive, who cares more about things that are spiritual than things that are earthly. So, that's the fit of poor as well. Not, you can be poor in spirit and be wealthy.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Maybe that speaks to the idea that, the poor here is not, it doesn't matter where you're socially you are or monetarily, but your attitude, right? Poor in spirit. That's a good point, Wes. That's a good point. Now, the rich, we've said a lot about the rich already. We'll just kind of mention a couple things here. It was the rich Jews who were oppressing the ethnic Jews who converted to Christianity. Right? They were taking advantage of them. They were extorting them in some cases. Typically, the way that they would be oppressed would be the withholding of wages. So if I was, a new convert to Christianity, I was ethnically Jewish, and you were my boss, and you were a Jew, and I did a day's worth of work for you, and it came paying time, you would say, forget it, go away, get out of here. And the reason that they could do that is because who am I going to turn to? Who am I going to take my case to help me out here? I can't go before the Jewish authorities because I'm a defect. I've defected from Judaism. The Romans don't care, right? So who am I going to go to for help? Nobody, right? And the Jewish leadership, the Jewish elite realized this. They realized this opportunity to exploit the poor, and they certainly took advantage of it. And there are other ways in which they were oppressed, but this seems to be one of the greatest, one of the most common. And then there's also, interestingly enough, there were these Jewish priests who were kind of sponsored by the state, by the Romans. They had sold their soul to the Romans for security and wealth, and they had their own form of tax collectors that they would send out to extort money from the Jewish people. Again, same situation. If this tax extorter, I'll say, instead of tax collector, this extortionist shows up at my door and demands that I give him money, who's going to help me turn him away? He's got the support of the Jewish hierarchy and the support of the Roman government as well. So they could take whatever they like, they could pretty much do whatever they like, and there was no one who could help me out. That's pretty much the situation that prevailed in the day. And a good example of this, one that maybe, I've never thought about, is in Acts chapter 9, what we find the Apostle Paul doing before he was the Apostle Paul. In Acts chapter 9, we know the story, we know Paul's story, but this is kind of the only glimpse that we get into the life of this Jewish mercenary, kind of, if you will. In Acts chapter 9, let's look at verses 1 through 2. It says, Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus. Notice that if he found any who were of the way, that means a Christian, any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Paul was basically a bounty hunter, commissioned by the Jewish leadership to go and arrest and bring before the court Jewish defects, people who have converted from Judaism to Christianity. Why were they brought before the court? That I don't exactly know. I assume to collect some fines, maybe, to punish them in some way, to bring them back from their defected state. But this kind of gives us a glimpse into a whole phenomenon, I guess, that was going on, that really Scripture doesn't mention, that I know about, a whole lot of it. Right? These bounty hunters, as we've called them, certainly Saul was not the only one doing this, who would go about and drag these defectors before the courts. And that's exactly what James says in verse 6, the end of verse 6. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Perhaps there's another type of court there in mind as well. But I think James has in mind what Saul was doing in Acts 9. So the rich, the elite, the well-off, the comfortable were oppressing the lower class, the poor of the people. I think we've made that point pretty clear. I won't say any more about that. Any thoughts before we move on now to verses 8 through 13? All right. 8 through 13, James continues to build on this idea of how absurd it is to practice favoritism, right? The rich, the ones that you're partial to, are they not the ones taking advantage of you, making your life miserable? Why would you ever show them partiality? But now in verses 8 through 13, he makes a different argument. Let's read verses 8 through 13. James says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin. So there he says it even plainer than in verse 4. If you show partiality, you commit sin, and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. This is a very rich section. There's a lot going on here. We could really divide this up probably several ways, but we will try to take it as a whole. We'll try to keep it simple. But the first point here that James makes in verses 8 and 9 is maybe profound is maybe a little too strong of a word, but kind of profound, the argument that he's making here. James says he's kind of offering up a possible excuse for partiality. Right? If I'm showing partiality, James says maybe my excuse is that I'm supposed to love everybody. I'm supposed to love that rich oppressor, the one who takes advantage of me, the one who oppresses the way was the word in Acts 9. Maybe I'm going to use that excuse. Well, aren't I to love everybody? James says, yes, you should love your neighbor as yourself. He says you do well if you do that. But verse 9, but if you show partiality, that is, if you go beyond, I think it's 2 John, verse 18 pops into my mind, but I'm almost positive that's wrong. But John says, if you go beyond the law, you transgress, you commit sin. Right? To go beyond is to sin. And that kind of comes to my mind here. Love everyone, even the rich oppressor. But to go beyond that, love into partiality, that's a sin. Right? You've gone too far. You've shown sin. And it's kind of subtle here, but it's kind of powerful, right? That James anticipates this excuse, that we're supposed to love everyone, so therefore we can be partial. In Matthew chapter 5, let's look at verses 43 through 48. Matthew chapter 5, 43 through 48. This is a section that's probably familiar to us rather. I know in Wes's class last quarter we looked at this in pretty good detail. But let's read through this. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 48. And as you turn there, I'll just say, in the first couple classes, first class, second class, maybe, we noted how similar Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the book of James tend to be. I mean, you can kind of line them up. A lot of commentators will do this, and make a big deal out of it. They'll kind of line up the Sermon on the Mount, and then they'll line up the book of James, and they'll make all these parallels where all kind of the same topics are addressed. And that's kind of what we see here in James 2 and now in Matthew chapter 5. Now, if we're there, let's look at verses 43 through 48. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." So in James chapter 2, when James quotes, really he's quoting from the Old Testament, but when James quotes from Jesus speaking here, do you suppose that he intended for this passage to kind of flash through their minds? Because how relevant is this passage to their situation? Pray for those who persecute you. Love those who spitefully use you. Right? That's exactly the situation that they were going through. So obviously it's relevant for us today, but how relevant for them in that time? Any thoughts on anything we've said so far before we dive back into the text there in James 2? Yes, sir.
Yeah, James clearly says that his letter is being sent to the dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
Who were persecuted, they've had to scatter, but that got the word out. Greek gave them the language, Rome gave them the roads they used to spread the gospel.
That's a good point, right? Yeah, very good point. Any other thoughts? Verses 10 and 11, you ever heard someone say, it's kind of one of those anecdotes that you hear all the time, Scripture is not a buffet. You can't pick and choose what you like and leave the rest, right? You probably have heard that. Maybe seen it on a meme on Facebook or someplace, right? And that's absolutely true. And that's the point that James makes in verses 10 and 11. He says, "If whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all." Verse 11, "He who said do not commit adultery also said do not murder. Now if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law." James' point is you've got to keep the whole thing, right? Maybe I don't go around murdering people like you said Daryl does at the beginning of class, but maybe I have another sin that I don't mind committing. Maybe there's another thing in my life that just doesn't really bother me as much as it should. James says you've got to either, it's an all or nothing kind of thing. Right? You either have to keep the whole law, or, I mean, he doesn't come out and say it this way, but I would go as far to say, don't bother. Right? Either be all in or just don't bother. In Revelation, this is the point that Jesus makes to, I believe, the church at Laodicea in chapter 3. Let's turn there, because this is maybe one, I mean, I know everybody who preaches or teaches a Bible class says that every other passage is their favorite passage. But Revelation chapter 3, verse 14 through 19, maybe one of my favorite passages in the New Testament, just because of how, I don't know, straightforward and practical it is. Would anyone like to read that for us? I've been reading a lot lately. Maybe you're tired of hearing my voice. Revelation chapter 3, 14 through 19. Any volunteers?
Very essential.
I heard him say that.
And to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, this thing says the man, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore, be zealous and repent.
Perfect. Thank you. So verses 16 and 17, or rather 15 and 16, are specifically the emphasis here, and then verse number 19 as well. Jesus says to the church at Laosia basically what James says to the dispersed, right? You can't be lukewarm. You either got to be hot or cold. And again, he doesn't exactly put it this way, but if you're not going to be hot, as he says here, the way he puts it, then don't even bother, right? Because the two combined, being lukewarm, doesn't do you any good anyway. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? That's the attitude that you ought to take if you don't plan on being all in. And that's pretty profound. That might be the word of the day, profound. That's pretty interesting, right? I mean, I can only speak from experience, but how relevant is that to our lives, right? We either have to be wholly dedicated or, again, why bother? And we've all got things that we find easy to do, right? I mean, coming to Bible study on a Wednesday night, you're here, maybe you think that's an easy thing to do, right? Coming to worship on Sunday morning, that's an easy thing to do. Those are the things that we don't mind doing. But what about the harder things, the things that we don't like to do? Evangelism, talking to people. And that's something that a lot of people don't like to do. It's hard for them to do, myself included. What about, calling people when they're sick? That's something that some people love to do. Other people, especially in today's age of texting and direct messaging on social media, calling somebody, checking in on them that way, visiting someone in person, that's something that maybe they don't like to do. We've all got things that are easy to us, things that are harder to us, but we've got to try to do all of them as best that we can. We can't be lukewarm. And again, I think I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, a Wednesday night crowd, but it's always nice to be reminded from time to time. Just because we don't commit adultery doesn't mean we can commit murder, in the words of James, right? James 2:11. We've got to keep the whole law. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Particularly verse 17. I don't know if it doesn't, I wish you could go for what I put but he says, because you say, they are their own God. Okay, and instead of going by what God says, and this is a man's study and meditation and application, they have their own version of what God wants them to do. They thought, you say but it is what God said. Because if they did, maybe they would see themselves as God said.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. That's exactly it. Well, that was the bell. Any last thoughts, though? Anything before we see each other again next week? All right. Well, I enjoyed it. Thank you for your participation, and I'll look forward to next week.
If you have your songbooks ready, 767 will be our invitation song. 767. I noticed today when I was going to the library that today, I guess it's the theme of poetry, poetry month, poetry day. I think it's poetry month, maybe. And I decided, well, you know what? Maybe I'll do something like that and bring up something I remember in the past. It was actually for one of my first lessons of what I did. I went to camp when I was about, I guess, I was about 19. And I tell you what, I didn't like to speak in public. I hated it. I know my dad would try to ask me to, do devotion, do something like that. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do it. And so anyway, and I went to camp and I was a camp counselor, and my director came up to me and said, Jeremy, you have the lesson tonight, the devotion for a friend of 50 kids or so tonight. And I was like, I'm good. But he said, no, you're going to do it tonight. So it was left at that. And so then I had to prepare. And so same time, I was like, I don't know what I was going to teach. I don't know what I was going to do. And I remembered my cousin went to preaching school, and I said, cousin, can you help me out? Do you have a lesson? So that he sent me one. And so I studied it. And I remember it was a poem. It started out in the beginning, and I believe it's by Robert Frost. And in the very end, he says, again, it's a poem on making this decision on two paths in life. In the end, he says, two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And the lesson that I did on that night was on the wide gate and the narrow gate. In Matthew chapter 7, let me read this verse here for you. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, enter ye the straight gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that lead to destruction, and many there be which go therein. Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and a few there be that find it. You know, sometimes in life, it's really hard to make that decision. You know, do I go this way or do I go that way? Do I follow along this way that's a lot more easier? It doesn't take that much effort to go in. This is where everyone's going. They're going down this way. Or do I take this path that hardly people are going down that path? You know, it looks more rocky, more hard to get to. It's kind of a situation I think about maybe with Roy. Roy's not here, so I mean I can talk about Roy. But you think about the situation when Roy tells me, "Hey, if we go through this way is easier for you. But if you go this way, when we get to the very end, it's going to be beautiful. You'll be able to see the mountains. You're going to see. It's just the sightseeing. It's worth it when you get there." You know, in our life or in our Christian life, sometimes we may get doubts. Sometimes we feel, you know what, it's not good enough for me. But we have to remember that the narrow path is the path that we have to be continuing in this life, because again, the reward is going to be something awesome. It's going to be something great. It's going to be something that no more tears, no more suffering. There's not going to be anything like that. And sometimes we think about that situation. Sometimes it gives us that boost to help us in our life to keep going in that path. Tonight, maybe you're struggling in your life. Maybe you're going through something. Maybe you know of someone who's struggling. Be there for that individual. Let us be there for you if you're going through something. So tonight, I encourage you, if you're subject to the invitation tonight, we like to be there for you. We like to pray for you. Why not take that opportunity tonight as we stand and sing this song?
Who at the door is standing, patient, calling near, the entrance attending happy, whose is the voice I hear, sweetly the tones are calling. Open the door for me. If thou be my calling, I will abide with thee. Door of my heart, I hasten. Thee will I open wide. Though weary youth and chasten, He shall with thee abide. Sweetly the tones are flowing. Open the door for me. If thou wilt be my calling, I will abide with thee.
It's good to see everyone here. We have some that aren't here due to some difficulties. Brother Roy's sister-in-law is not far from passing from this life. He's with her and Betty tonight. So let's remember Roy's sister-in-law in our prayers as they deal with this difficult time at this particular point in their lives. Sad to say also along that line that last night at 11 o'clock, little Carter Horde passed away. So if you would remember that family in your prayers. And it's sad. Older people we expect, but not children. It's a sad thing. So if you would just remember that family in your prayers. Continue to remember the others who are sick, those that's in the bulletin, those that we've been mentioned of in our prayers. Brother Ken, as he continues to deal with his hip issue, Brother Carroll and others. If you would just look in the bulletin and those are in there. A few things to remind us of. Our egg hunt is this Saturday. Peggy made some beautiful signs today. They are, one is up here and one is down there. So drive by, take a camera, put it on Facebook, all that stuff. Great job. No, but it does look good. So we appreciate her doing that. So remember that at 2:00, Brother Jeremy and myself are down here putting the signs up, and we talked to some folks and they're coming. So bringing their kids. Hopefully we're going to have a place to give out Bible literature. It's not just about eggs. That's just secondary. The main reason we're getting them here is to try to teach the law. So we're going to have a table of giving out Bible material, Bible courses. So remember that. Our gospel meeting, the 24th, the next weekend with Brother Brian Kenyon. And remember him and his wife as they travel. If you want to have him in your home or take him out to eat or whatnot, or if you just like to give money, you can talk to Brother Vince and Sister Miriam, and they'll give you the details about that. Friday at 6:30, we're going to meet here at the church building. That'll give you time to go out and eat or whatever you want to do. You can eat afterwards. We're going to meet here at 6:30 and canvass the neighborhood and give out invitations to the egg hunt, right, Brother Jeremy? So do what? Egg hunt and the gospel meeting. So that'll be this Friday at 6:30. So as many as we can have, that way we'll kind of pair up and get as many houses as we can. So that's all the announcements that I have. If I missed anybody, Lori.
I had a coworker who I grew up with. They found him, he died this week, last night.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So remember that family in your prayers. Just a little note. Anytime we have an opportunity to reach the lost, I was talking to a guy last night at the ball game, and he, I've talked to him a few times about the gospel, invited him to church and prayed for him and stuff when he was sick. And he didn't really understand why God takes a little child. So this might be an opportunity to talk to people of why we're not here forever, why this world isn't our home. So, that's just a thought that, death is a sad thing, but it's also a great thing for those who are faithful. So this time we'll have a closing prayer.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you, all the wonderful blessing given us. If they're sick and read and comfort them, especially our number. Thank you for the ones that are better and back with us, if I will. Continue with us as we have our upcoming meeting, may it be a success, win souls to Christ, if I will. Go with our party, our separate ways, brings back the next point in time. Christ, we pray. Amen.